In this lesson, you're going to use corresponding parts of congruent triangles. The objective is to use triangle congruence and the corresponding parts of those congruent triangles to prove that parts of two triangles are congruent. So, once you know that two triangles are congruent, just put a congruence marking there. Once you know that two triangles are congruent, you can make conclusions about their other corresponding parts. Because by definition, corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. But we're going to use this quite a bit as a reason in our proofs to prove angles are congruent or to prove sides are congruent. So we're going to abbreviate this with the first letter of some of these words here. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. We're going to abbreviate that CPCTC. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So let's look at problem number 1. In problem number 1, you're asked to prove that angle T is congruent to angle S. So the first thing you're going to have to do is prove that these two triangles are congruent, and then using CPCTC you can state that those two angles are congruent. So let's look at the triangles first to see if we can prove them congruent. The information that's given, we have RS, let's mark that on the diagram. RS is congruent to UT. I'll go ahead and write this down. RS is congruent to UT because that's given. And we have RT is congruent to US. Let's use a different congruence marking. RT is congruent to US is also given. So what else do we have that we can use to prove that these two triangles are congruent? We have a shared side. That shared side in the middle. RU is congruent to RU because of the reflexive property of congruence. Anything is congruent to itself. And now we can state that the two triangles are congruent. So we have triangle RTU is congruent to triangle USR because of side, side, side. Triangle congruence. And now that we know that the triangles are congruent, we can now state that other corresponding parts are congruent. And the ones that we're supposed to prove are T. Angle T is congruent to angle S because corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. CPCTC. In the second problem, we have two other triangles, and we're supposed to prove that angle T is congruent to angle U. So once again, we need to see what information we're given to determine if we can prove that these two triangles are congruent. And if we can prove the triangles are congruent, then we can state that any of the other corresponding parts are congruent. So let's look at what we're given and mark it on the diagram again. We have RS, side RS is congruent to side VS. And that's given. And we have side RT that's congruent to side VU. Mark that with a different congruence marking. Is also given. And we're also told that angle R and angle V. Angle R and angle V are right angles. That's also given. So from that statement, that leads us to say that angle R is congruent to angle V because of the right angle congruence theorem, which states that all right angles are congruent. And now we can state that these two triangles are congruent. Triangle TRS is congruent to triangle UVS because we have side angle side. We have two pairs of corresponding sides that are congruent, and the included angle that is between those sides is congruent. So we can use side angle side triangle congruence. Now that we've determined that the triangles are congruent, we can state that angle T is congruent to angle U because corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. CPCTC.